Okay, so I'm here with Ricardo and Raphael, and we're going to be talking about Arkane's Prey, a game that we've just seen a lot more during the keynote. I mean, we saw a lot more of the game than I was expecting, and a lot of very arcane touches and a lot of new ideas as well. The first thing I want to kind of touch upon is the open world setting. You talked about how you can go anywhere in the game, and the whole space station where the game is set on is open. Can you tell us a little bit about that and the design challenges that presented when you're making an immersive sim?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So what I mentioned was that the structure of the space station is open-ended. So that means that the player can go anywhere inside the space station that they have the means to access. So some places will be inaccessible until you have figured out how to get in there. But once you've figured it out, it's open and you can go back and forth. And then we also modeled the entire outside of the space station. So the outside is one big, almost kind of like an open world map, because you can go anywhere. And later when you decide, okay, I'm down here and I need to get up here, what do I want to do? Do I want to take the main elevator? Maybe there's monsters there, so forget about that. Maybe I want to chart a course on the outside instead. It's totally up to players how they navigate through the station.
Yeah. The thing that is important to note is the difference between Dishonored. Dishonored is a set of missions after missions, right? And each of them have their own sandboxy kind of gameplay, where you can do things the way you want. In our case, instead of being one after the next, it's all these areas we can come back to. So it's all one big contiguous space, really.
It's a nightmare.
Okay, so when you were building a space like this with immersive sims, when there's a lot of the gameplay is to do with your interaction with the environment as much as the NPCs and the challenges within it. How do you go about making a more open-ended world that still kind of gives you, the designer, the chance to make something that feels like an authored experience for the player?
Yeah, so that was, going into this, that was something that was challenging for us. But you know, Arkane has experience making a game like this. They did Arx Fatalis a long time ago, which was a super cool, underground dungeon kind of game that was structured in a similar way. It was like an open-ended structure. So one of the things that we have done is tried to make sure that, of course, the first time you visit an area, there's a bunch of interesting crafted situations going on. But on return visits, the aliens themselves, they have their own agenda. So when you come back at different phases of the game, they're doing things. Some of the other characters in the station are also doing things. So when you return to maps for later quests, there'll be surprises.
Yeah, the thing I want also to note to say is that when people think open world, they think of something that's pretty diluted, I guess. And Arkane, we are trained really to do things that are more with a certain level of detail. So if you think of the level of detail of Dishonored, we have the same level of detail, and so it's pretty zoomed in, right? So it's not open world in the sense of you run around for miles. It's more like an open structure in the way that you can always come back to places, and the context might have changed, as Ricardo was saying. But the level of detail is the one of our kind of games.
Okay, so let's talk about Prey itself. I mean, obviously there's a storied history to the IP, but you guys are putting your own stamp on it. But can you tell us what inspirations you've taken from the original IP that you've brought through? Because I mean, this is a hugely different experience, complete reboot. But there must be one or two things that you thought, that's a cool idea. Was there anything like that?
Well, you know, when we were after we made Dishonored, there was a set of options that we had, and we wanted to make Dishonored 2, so part of the team did that, and then we also wanted to make a game in space where there's a lot, there's the survival aspect, some sort of ecology, so something that we are describing right now, right? Like the more open structure thing, and Bethesda said, well, why don't you do with this franchise, and so in our mind it was, well, from high level it's the same because it's shooting aliens in space and escaping a space station, and it's in first person, so but this is pretty much the only direct link with the original, because other than the high level concept, we pretty much started from scratch and did our own version of that.
Yeah, this is very much an Arkane game, which means, like Raph is saying, a huge amount of attention to detail in world design. So we want the space station itself to be one of the most memorable characters of the game. And secondly, it means it's a game where players get to play their own way. So it's like, here's this cool world, here's all these cool powers and tools and environmental interactions. It's up to you now, player, to decide how to solve problems.
You talk about the environmental interactions and the cool abilities. One of the ones that we saw was the mimic, and that drew a nice reaction from the crowd. Can you tell us about some of these cool new tricks that you're kind of going to give to the players when they get aboard the space station?
So Mimic is one of the coolest powers in the game, I think. It's probably one of the powers that the team itself has had the most fun with. And you know, just like on Dishonored, there were moments where somebody on the team did something unexpected, you know, and they were like, oh my gosh, that's cool, we have to like make that happen more in the game. And so Mimic is like that. Like the demonstration you saw where the player turned into a recycler charge and then used kinetic blast to like launch themselves up to the second tier. Like that, we didn't pre-plan that. A level designer came up with that and was like, look at this cool thing I can do with these two powers. And so there's other things like that in the game that we hope players discover.
And what can you tell us about the enemy design? Because they look really creepy. You've created like a really interesting design there, and there seems to be a lot of scope for kind of enemies adapting, things like that. What can you tell us about the kind of construction of those this new alien threat?
So it's a very interesting question, because it was at the very beginning when we started to design aliens. One thing that was clear in our mind was that we did not want classic aliens. You know, there are like 3 archetypes that everybody knows, right? And so we wanted to come up with something that was different. And so we went more with the paranormal, psionic powers, kind of ghostly stuff, yet alien at the same time. And so it took a long time. It was a pretty long process to, you know, see exactly where we're going, like what is the material exactly that it is made of, what can they do, what is the story behind all of this so that it actually makes sense, what is the ecology between all the species of aliens, like how do they multiply, how, you know, is there a hierarchy, what is their purpose, etc., etc. So it's been an interesting process.
Yeah, those things that Raph has mentioned are the kinds of things that players will uncover as they progress through the game. What are the relationships between them? What are the things they can do? As we mentioned in the video, the powers that you learn from the aliens.
Okay, so what can you tell us about the story and the narrative from the game? Because I know you're not going to want to go into too many spoilers, but can you give us the broad strokes and kind of set up the scenario for us?
Yeah, so you play Morgan Yu, and we are going to let players choose their gender. But you play Morgan Yu. Morgan Yu is the key subject in an experiment that's taking place aboard the space station. But when you emerge from the experiment, everything on board the station has gone sideways. There's aliens running around everywhere. Most of the people are dead, not everybody. And so you have to figure out, like, what is going on? How did I get here? Why am I even here on the space station? There's a bunch of interesting things about your past, which I won't go into, but you will discover throughout the game. And then as you progress, you'll meet people who are survivors like you, who have like barricaded themselves or are hiding somewhere, and they have their own story. And you'll get to, in traditional Arkane fashion, you'll get to decide, like, what do I do with this person? Do I help them? Do I hinder them? Do I side with them? And that, of course, has consequences in the end of the game.
Is there like a morality system like there is with Dishonored?
In a way, yes, but not as a system so much. It's like we do care about morality every time. You know, it's all about acknowledging what the player does, and if he does things that, you know, if he makes those choices of not helping people or doing things that are going to make it that they're going to die, then we want to acknowledge that. And then there's, I mean, I'm of course not going to talk about the ending, but it all matters. That's the thing to remember. It will all matter at the end. What your choice is, like, who do you decide lived or not, will matter.
I'm going to take a stab in the dark and say, is this something that you're building for people to have multiple playthroughs then?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. But on the level of the story, you know, like who you help, who you don't help, what the endings are like, and then on the level of like what kind of character are you playing, what upgrades did you choose, did you avoid alien powers, because you can play the game without any alien powers, or you can go deep on the alien powers. All of that stuff matters.
So you say endings, there's going to be lots of different kind of avenues and different ways for people to conclude the story?
Yeah, I mean, without, I'm not sure I want to give a number exactly, but at some point we were listing all the main endings and then the sub-cases of like, you know, if you do this but not that, etc. There's a fair amount of permutation there.
Yep.
Okay, permutations is a good angle to take for the next question, because, and this is an Arkane game, there's a lot of options in front of the player. My question is, has the sci-fi setting and the additional I'd say that the Dishonored angle, I mean, that never held you back from kind of coming up with creative ways of disposing of people or sneaking past people, but has the sci-fi setting kind of given you a lot more scope and for kind of creative ideas and for taking that kind of the immersive sim genre into new and exciting directions?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I was going to say something about Dishonored, and because it was part of the process too, where, you know, when you create this world and at some point you realize, is it enough for the gadgets that we want? Because there's, of course, there's the fiction and then there's the gameplay part. And so in the case of Dishonored, adding magic and all that was actually really helpful, because then suddenly we had like access to a lot more fun. In this case, we say the same way Dishonored was our version of steampunk, this is kind of our version of sci-fi. It's not exactly the sci-fi that you've seen before. There's the definition of our world is really unique to our game. And yes, of course, then it's awesome, because like there's this technology, but we can do crazy stuff. All of it needs to be justified by the story of our world and how does this type of technology that we want to use for our gadget fits into the world, right? So we cannot do. In our case, we decided not to have teleportation. Well, now if we want it, we can still use psionic powers, but as far as the technology goes, we had to be really coherent with what we wanted, and we went with a fairly grounded type of sci-fi, something that has so much explanation behind that it kind of feels like real.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It has to be grounded in our setting. And the thing that I love about my favorite kinds of games, and this game in particular, is just when you're playing a game and you get that feeling of like, oh, I want to try this, and like you kind of like hope it'll work, you know, and then you try it and the developers put that in the game and it did work, and suddenly as a player you feel like so like just psyched because acknowledged because you devised a plan in your mind and you tried it and the game reacted and it worked, and that's what we try to inject into the game as much as possible. That like, what if I do this, what if I do this, what if I do this? We call it saying yes to the player as much as possible.
Okay, so you it was mentioned during the keynote that Prey is going to come out next year. What platforms are we looking at?
So it's going to be PC, PS4, Xbox One, and that's it for now.
Are you doing any extra work for the souped-up consoles, the Neo and the Scorpio?
We're looking at those. There's nothing we can talk about since, but we're of course looking at those.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your time, and
thanks a lot, man.
look forward to seeing more of the game.
All right.
Cheers, guys.
Thank you.